So welcome everyone. I'm Tyler Putman with the Museum of the American Revolution. We're here for another one of our Meet the Revolution conversations. I'm really excited today to be joining Daniel Sieh. You might recognize Daniel from work in our Among His Troops exhibition, where he was dressed as a Commander-in-Chief's guard. You might have run into him when our tent replicas are traveling at events like Mount Vernon or at our Occupied Philadelphia Living History events. But if you haven't met Daniel, I'm really excited to have a conversation with him today about Asians and Pacific Islanders in the 18th century and in revolutionary America. So thanks for joining us, Daniel.
Thank you very much for having me here. And hello to everyone joining on this stream. I'd like to start by briefly introducing myself. As said before, my name is Daniel Sieh, and I've been working with living history for the past 8 years, including 3 years working with the museums like Colonial Williamsburg and Clubmore Farm, and assisting with the museums like MOAR, which is a huge pleasure. I graduated from William & Mary in 2016, and I just finished getting my master's degree from American University in 2020. And what drew me to history and to the American Revolution in particular was the fact that it's studying the story of us, the United States, and to a certain extent, the lofty ideas that it's based on: life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness, and the fact that all men are created equal. Now, whether we have lived up to those ideas during the revolution, that's an interesting discussion. But I feel that by studying this history, we can start to actually live up to these ideas today.
Daniel, I'm really curious how how you got started on this, your origin story. How did you become interested in the story of Asians in the Revolutionary era?
You can say that this is something that it's deeply personal to me because, as you can tell, I have a personal interest as being an Asian American, and I kind of felt it in, point blank on my skin. I first started doing living history because I was just interested into it. And when I was volunteering or working in the museum field, visitors would ask me if I was supposed to be there. And I didn't have a good answer to that. I asked around and I did some research, and most friendly museum staff or researchers said, well, there has to be a couple lying around, but I don't really know. And I just did some more digging in archives. And unfortunately, a lot of what I found was anecdotal at best or hearsay at worst. And that does not hold up to modern scrutiny, and especially to modern research standards. So I decided to answer that question not only for myself, but to perhaps help others and see if I can garner some interest in this really under-researched topic, backed up by proper research and primary sources, evidence dating to that time period. Because as we can see that what's happened recently with the current rise in Asian hate crimes is becoming quite pertinent. And I think by including this discussion, by saying that yes, Asians were part of the American story from the beginning, I think we can perhaps, destroy some of these perceptions that Asians are foreigners and that they don't belong in the United States.
I think that's a really incredible personal mission. And I want to pick your brain about Asians in the 18th century and in the Revolutionary in particular. But before we do, I'm curious if you could tell us your opinions on why we don't know this story, or maybe another way to ask this question is are there particular research challenges when you are trying to trace the history of early American Asians? Are there hurdles you have to get over?
I think I'll break that answer into two parts. The first one being like, how come we just don't know a lot about this, or how come it hasn't been researched before? And I think it's because of two reasons. Number one, it is incredibly difficult, and I'll elaborate that on the second part of this answer. And the other part to this answer right now is that, quite honestly, there just wasn't a lot of interest into this topic at first because Asians only make about 1 or 2% of the population of the United States. So it's not really pertinent to a lot of people in general, too. And I think just, that's something that African Americans have faced as well. Until recently, I would say the 70s and 80s, African American history or the history of other minorities in the United States just has been given a lot of scholarship attention, and even less to speak about the general perception in popular mind about minorities in there. And it's been a kind of an uphill battle, but recently has been, there's been a shift and people are starting to include more diverse topics. Now, going back to what makes it so difficult to research, I would say that there's a three-part answer to this as well. Number one, if you think about it, if they're coming from Asia, if they leave any historical records behind, they'll be written in their own native languages. So it makes their preservation throughout history incredibly rare and almost impossible, because if people stumbled on that, they would just throw it away because they wouldn't understand the value behind it. And if they ever went back to Asia, they'll be in the Asian archives in their own home countries. And unfortunately, due to the turmoil of Asian history in the 20th century, there's a good chance that a lot of them have been destroyed, or they're sitting there collecting dust untranslated. The second problem is that, just based on my research, they are usually coming to North America as servants or enslaved people. And people who study African American history run into the same problem. Due to their low status, they just don't tend to leave a lot of written records behind. And either because they were never taught how to read or write, or their records are not deemed worthy enough to be preserved, and also due to the fact that as enslaved people, they're a lot of times they were actively prohibited from learning how to read and write and leave these records behind. The third reason is that the other part is archaeology. You cannot determine if an item belonged to an Asian person or to a white person or to a black person. They're just an object. And furthermore, even if it is a strictly Asian object, we see a lot of these export items coming to North America because they're just highly desirable. So it means that we can only derive our research of Asians from the impressions that they leave behind on people around them. It's almost like trying to tell a face through a silk screen. It's difficult, but thankfully, thanks to a lot of help from people and thanks to this research, we can actually derive some tantalizing insights that I cannot wait to just go into it right now.
Yeah, I'm really excited to hear what we do know. I mean, at the museum, we believe that a more diverse story is a more accurate story. So part of our mission is to explore the diverse people, the complex events right at the beginning of United States history. And I think it's really exciting to continue to explore all of these avenues. So maybe a good place to start is given the limitations of our source material, what do we know about Asians in early America in general? What are the high points or the traces that we've been able to detect?
Right, and before even going to talk about the people, I want to make sure that everybody just take a step back and be aware that Asian goods like tea, cotton, silk, and spices were already present throughout the North American continent and were quite popular and widespread. We see porcelain coming to North Carolina in droves, and as a matter of fact, I think Asia plays a pivotal role in talking about the revolution because, after all, they people picked an Asian good, tea, to make a huge political statement that started the revolution, the Boston Tea Party. Because I'm not sure if you noticed, there's not a lot of tea plantations in Boston itself. And so what we can tell from Asians is that there weren't a lot of them, but they're pretty widespread. And I think that's a better answer than just none at all. There weren't, there were about at least 100 or so at best, but I think they leave an interesting impression on people around them. So the first one is that they're probably serving as sailors and sometimes as servants and enslaved people. I want you to direct to a runaway ad that I found in the New York Gazette, or the Weekly Postboy, from July 28th, 1763. And it reads the following: taken up and committed to the jail in Perth Amboy, a black boy about 16 years of age, with bushy hair, not resembling the African Negroes, had on a check shirt, Osnaburg trousers, speaks good English, says he was born in Bombay in the East Indies, and they came to New York from Santa Croix, and then Snow Nancy, captained by Captain Hind, and he is now taken upon suspicion of being a runaway slave or servant. If he is such, his master, by applying to the jailer and Amboy aforesaid and paying the charges, can have him. Perth Amboy, July 20th, 1763. So I think it's very interesting that they make the distinction that, yes, even though he is, of a dark skin tone, he is very distinct from African Americans. They make the distinction there in the Runaway ad that he's not an African American. It's clear. And he's saying he's from Bombay and he's from the East Indies. Now, whether he's from the Caribbean, it could be too, but they're usually referred in the time signature as East Indians. And that's a general description of everybody coming from East Asia in general. That can be from India, Bengal, China, Japan, there's general East Indies. So making a call of specifically what part of Asia they're from is difficult. But based on the physical description, we can make a good call that this gentleman here, this boy that was taken up, is probably from Southeast Asia, probably India, in particular Bengal. Now, another one that I found that is very interesting too is from the Virginia Gazette, the Rhine version from Williamsburg, August 4th, 1768. And Richmond County, July 14th. Runaway about the 20th of May last, an East Indian man named Thomas Greenwich. He is a well-made fellow, about 5 feet 4 inches high, wears his own hair, which is long and black, has a thin visage, a very slight look, and a remarkable set of fine white teeth. A reward of 40 shillings will be paid to the person who delivers him to the subscriber, besides what the law allows. William Colston. So we can see here that they're very distinct, and they're, at the same time, they're still held at this lower social class on the same level as African Americans that are enslaved in the time period. But at the same time, we see from this tombstone that we have the central burying ground in Boston. Yes, here lies interred the body of Chow Mandarin, a native of China, aged 19 years, whose death was occasioned on the 11th of September, 1798, by a fall from the masthead of the ship Mac of Boston, and the stone was erected to his memory by his affectionate master, John Boyd Jr. So it's really interesting here that it kind of corroborates some of the other evidence that I found later that these Chinese, Asians are coming from, you know, China, India, Bengal, and they're serving as enslaved people, servants, but also as sailors, which makes sense because a lot of the research too is better documented in England, just because there's probably more evidence of them there, high population density, high demographics, and also it is a huge center of trade to the point where we have the story of another person called John Anthony. And from William Cobbett, Cobbett's Parliamentary Debates, Volume 3, page 630, we have a mention of him because he is a native of China, and there's enough Asians hired by the British East India Company serving as sailors to justify hiring a Chinese person exclusively to serve as a liaison between the company and the sailors. And in the record there by William Cobbett, we have his deposition. Mr. John Anthony, a native of China, an interpreter for the East India Company, had the oaths of abjuration and fidelity duly administered to him previous to the second reading of the bill for his naturalization, then upon the table, which proceeding having taken place, the bill was referred to a private committee, adjourned. So not only is he hired as a liaison, he applies for and is granted British citizenship, which is absolutely fascinating. And plus, there's another also sketch by Gabriel Brave, and it has an image of what possibly is an Oriental seaman. Now, the Oriental attribution was added to the portrait in the 19th century, but I think it's still like a tantalizing potential glimpse into what these sailors would have looked like and what they're doing. So it's just fascinating, fascinating stuff.
That's amazing. I think it's incredible to kind of populate our world of Britain and early America, sailors, interpreters, people who just kind of wash up on foreign shores after fascinating life histories, runaway, enslaved people, and servants. Do we know anything specifically about Asians and Asian Americans in the American Revolutionary period?
Yes, Tyler. Besides the context of them just living and being living their lives in the 1760s to 1790s as sailors and servants, we can document at least 4 individual Asians serving as soldiers in the Revolution, 2 for the British and 2 in the Continental Army. And this came thanks to the research of Robert A. Seelig, John Rees, and Don Haggis, and Justin Clement. Without their help, I could have not drilled down to this level of detail. So we can tell that we have to serving the British Army. And interestingly enough, they kind of built on this British tradition of having what you call exotic musicians. So oftentimes we see British regiments having African American drummers, and this all seems to extend to Asians from all these stories. What is the story that I want to highlight? And this is a story of somebody called Charles Peters. And his story, I'm surprised it hasn't been made into a movie. And originally, I first came upon his like actual tale from the research of John Reese. He sent it to me a deserter ad that reads the following. Let's see here. Yes. $10 reward deserted from me the 12th of this instant on their march from Halifax. Two soldiers belonging to the 5th Battalion of the state, William Watson and Charles Peters. Watson has deserted 5 times. He has also cost the public 20 odd pounds for taking him up and jail fees. He's about 5 feet 10 inches high, dark complexion, black hair, lives near the Bay River below Newburn. Now, Peters is an East Indian, formerly the property of Mr. Thompson in Newburn. Ben Stedman, the North Carolina Gazette, May 1st, 1778. So as you can tell here that the first part is okay, but the second part describing Charles Peters, that he is an East Indian and the property of Tomlinson in Newburn, was not only a unique find because it's also the second evidence of an Asian survey in the Revolution, but also because it allowed us to research further. And the more we dug up, we were able to find so much. And this is thanks to the research Justin Clement. He helped me really dig into the story. And the story of Charles Peters is absolutely fascinating because we were able to find so much documentation behind him. So first, we find him that he's actually probably born to a lady called Asia by her master. So that's even further proof that he's probably somewhere in Asia. But based on our research, he's actually probably born in Bengal, in the outpost of Pondicherry, when he was probably under French control. And after the siege of Pondicherry by the British in the 7 Years' War, he was transferred basically to British servitude, to the point where we have the first evidence of him in North America, circa 1765, 1775, where we have a certain James Blount of Craven County, North Carolina, advertising, first purchased the Indian after his importation, and an advertisement in North Carolina Gazette. And he's importing them from East India. So that's probably Charles Peters right over there. And he was sold to a gentleman called John Edge Tomlinson, which, as you remember, is referenced in the deserter ad. And from there, we can go to his county records. And interesting, Tomlinson also leaves a lot of records behind. So we can cross-check both Tomlinson and Peters and get a very interesting story. So Tomlinson appears to have been a loyalist, and he was actually jailed following his refusal to give the oath of abjuration allegiance in 1777. And Charles Peter, being his manservant, was confiscated from him because he was a loyalist and he had his property confiscated from him. And as soon as he was locked up, the Committee of Safety had Peters released. And then he was then taken up to his first probably enlistment in the Continental Army by a gentleman called Abner Nash. But afterwards, Tomlinson recanted and he gave his oath of abjuration and loyalty to the Continental Congress. So he was, given his property back, and that included Charles Peters. But then they got involved in an intense legal battle where the county said, no, Peters belongs to his property and belongs to Tomlinson as part of his property, but the state saying no, he took up his oath as a soldier, and based on the promise of freedom, if he served the Continental Army, he should be given his freedom. And he got protracted, and to make a long story short, he went back and forth a couple of times. Eventually, the final decision was made that he would indeed serve in the Continental Army, and he enlisted in the 5th North Carolina Regiment. And because we see him under his own name in the muster rolls. And we can document serving potentially in the Battle of Monmouth and the Battle of White Plains. And eventually he made the desertion in 1778, but he rejoined his regiment and probably he wasn't punished just because we see him again in muster rolls. He also probably serves again in Valley Forge too as well. He probably wasn't punished because he probably joined a different regiment, and that's a common practice see in different soldiers is deserting and joining different regiments to collect a re-enlistment bounty. Unfortunately, he joins a North Carolina regiment just in time to be sent to the siege of Charleston. And we all know how this story ends. He is captured as a POW, and then later on we see his record of his name in a loyalist company. So it seems like he gave up the Continental Army and then went on to serve in a loyalist unit who was then transferred to Barbados, where we potentially think he died of disease or he was even perhaps murdered there. We just don't know. We're still digging up the end part of his life, but still a fascinating history. We have a gentleman born in Bengal under French control, which then passes to British control, is sent to North America as an enslaved person in North Carolina, joins the Continental Army, fights in White Plains, Monmouth, and then he's sent to Charleston, where he's captured as a POW, and then goes on to serve in a loyalist unit in Barbados. Man, isn't that a story and a half right there?
Yeah, that's like a story where like if you made it into a mini series, people would think you had invented it. Like, oh, that's very convenient that this person ends up in all these places. But here's an actual person who, almost goes halfway around the world. And of course, their early life fights on both sides, maybe of the American Revolution.
Oh,
Uh,
absolutely.
that's incredible. I wonder, as we sort of wrap up, I guess I have two questions, but the first is, uh, are there unanswered questions that you'd love to find, or what are the kind of future avenues of research for people who are interested in Asians in early America? What do you think we should be chasing down next?
Well, I've been digging through the runaway ads using particularly a web scraper to look for the words East Indiaman or East Indian, just because it is the easiest way to actually look through. Tons of archives have been digitized. But I think now that we actually know what we're looking for is just going through a lot of the previous research, because I'm sure that there's muster rolls, archives sitting somewhere in there where we have more East Indians, but due to their low numbers, they're just so spread out that it's going to take a lot of time and effort just to go through all these previous muster rolls from decades of being researched and just going back to them and looking for these keywords that now we know. Furthermore, an extra part of layer difficulty is just unearthing all these names, because as we saw before, Charles Peters, they are all given anglicized names or Western names. So looking for them based on them is impossible. You have to look for these little keywords, and these are a little gem, finding these needles in haystacks, basically, and just going through them all over again with the new eyes.
I think that's amazing. I mean, how exciting to be in a position where we've now scholars have worked with these records for decades and overlooked these things, but now thanks to digitization and new research, we're still learning things from 250-year-old documents and sort of detecting people who had been missed. I mean, it's amazing from your conversation to realize that there were people in early America from the Indian subcontinent, from China, from Pacific Islands, that all of these people might have walked past you on the streets of revolutionary Philadelphia. They might have walked right by where our museum is today. So, Daniel, what do you think are the most important takeaways of this story for our guests and our viewers?
I would say that there are two major takeaways or lessons to be learned from this. That the history of the United States, even from its very beginning, included narratives and stories from groups of people that are very different from what the general public imagines in their minds or that movies and television say. It's very telling that the Constitution starts with its preamble with "we the people." And while the definition of what constituted the American people has changed, I think their underlying stories have not. And I think that we cannot forget that. And to make it clear that the American story does not belong to any one particular group, but to us all. The second lesson I want people to take away is that everyone that feels that if you're being left out, if you're from a minority or from a group that's not been, mentioned in the history books too much, or they feel excluded by all the monuments, paintings, movies, TV series, and comics in the spotlight, and even if they turn the spotlight to you, that you feel like in the history you're portrayed as a victim without agency, this is to you. This goes to you and all of you. I want you to know, and I want people to understand that there's stories out there of people like you, yourselves with agency, who are present and who are doing things that are often ignored because they were not the elites or part of the desired element of society. But however, you're still part of the American story, and this story is yours too.
What an amazing way to end. I really hope that the Museum of the American Revolution can be a resource to people as they realize that. We have some amazing objects on display. We highlight stories in our living history programming and our programs like this that continue to surprise me. I think continue to help people realize that the revolution is a story that should belong to them, that is accessible to anyone who finds themselves interested in the topic. I wonder, Daniel, if people are interested in researching their own past or researching Asian American history or just kind of keeping up with your work, are there places online that they can connect with you?
Absolutely. Feel free to follow me on Instagram. It's Daniel C with 2 E's at the end, 1781. Also, feel free to follow me on Facebook too, Daniel C. And I'll make sure to put it on the screen too, so it's easier for people to follow. Always happy to answer any questions because I feel that research that is hoarded is useless. This research is there to be shared with people.
Well, Daniel C., thank you again for meeting with us as part of this Meet the Revolution program. And we can't wait to follow your research and keep up with all the exciting discoveries that we're going to make next.
Absolutely. Thank you very much for having me here. Have a